$1 million. Free to play. You just need to survive. It's the Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Pick one team to win each week. Get it right, move on. Get it wrong, you're out. The last fans standing take home a guaranteed $1 million cash prize. And for every player who joins, we add $1 to the pot, up to $10 million. The Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Play free on the Fanatics app. App access open to all. Must be 21 plus and joined by 9/8 to play. No purchase necessary. U.S. only. Void where prohibited. Subject to complete terms. See fanatics.com/game rules.
Getting ready to step into your career era? Set yourself apart with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Hone your skills with apps like Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, and more, powered with the latest in creative AI. Students save over 55% so you can build a portfolio you're proud of. Launch your future with Adobe Creative Cloud Pro for students. Visit adobe.com/students to learn more.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
You are now entering the Stone Zone. Well, Chicago is experiencing a bloodbath, a crime epidemic. President Donald Trump seems poised to move the National Guard to Chicago, which he has the authority to do by declaring it a national emergency. Let's listen to the president.
Make your mind up on Chicago, though?
Well, we're going in. I didn't say when. We're going in. When you lose, look, I have an obligation. This isn't a political thing. I have an obligation. When we lose, when 20 people are killed over the last 2.5 weeks and 75 are shot with bullets. So let me tell you a little story about a place called D.C., District of Columbia, right here where we are. It's now a safe zone. We have no crime. It's in such great shape. You can go and actually walk with your children, your wife, your husband. You can walk right down the middle of the street. You're not going to be shot, Peter. You're safe.
I think the president's made it very clear that he's preparing to move on Chicago. As I said, Chicago experienced a bloodbath over the Labor Day weekend. 52 people shot, 8 people killed, 4 mass shootings. Now, just looking at last year, there were 225,000 911 calls to the Chicago police that went completely unanswered. The police force itself is down by 1,600 police officers. Nobody will apply for those jobs. We'll talk later in the show with former Chicago Police Superintendent Richard Brezek, who will tell us exactly why that is. 90% of the violent criminals who are arrested are back out on the street with a cashless bail system. 67,000 criminals skipped out on their follow-up hearings, yet Governor J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson continue to reject help from the Trump administration. Listen to Mayor Johnson.
Are you prepared to defend this land that was built by slaves, a land that was built by indigenous people, a land that is built by workers? Are you prepared to defend this land? The people united will always prevail. I need you all to stand firm, to stand strong. If this president decides to continue to break this Constitution.
This is a man completely out of control. I would argue that that's the mayor of Chicago who is advocating insurrection. The president of the United States has full legal authority to declare a national emergency. The statistics that I just read to you show that Chicago is experiencing an emergency, and I predict right here and now that he will mobilize the National Guard and they will restore safety to the streets of Chicago. The president cited the example of the District of Columbia. If you look at the comments of actual residents of D.C., they're very pleased with the fact that the president has moved the National Guard in and he has restored safety. But his crime turned Chicago upside down. J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Johnson vehemently refused the cooperation of the National Guard and ICE agents to protect the streets. You see, they care more about their political party and their leftist ideology than they do protecting their constituents. The people of Chicago and liberal cities across the country are getting a rude awakening that they are doomed to live in dangerous conditions as long as Democrats are in charge. Again, later on in the show, former Chicago Superintendent of Police Richard Brezak joins us to give us an expert analysis of the situation in the Windy City. Meanwhile, I was in touch with the family of Mayor Rudy Giuliani. Many of you know the mayor was injured in a car accident several days ago. The good news is the mayor is on the mend. He's doing fine. He's one tough son of a gun who has been a target of political persecution and prosecution. Why? Because he vigorously represented the interests of his client as an attorney. President Trump has done the right thing by deciding to award the Presidential Medal of Freedom to America's mayor, Rudy Giuliani, after it was announced that the mayor suffered in this car accident and left him with major spinal injuries. I'm proud to say that I was a volunteer in Rudy Giuliani's first campaign for mayor. He was elected mayor of New York City in his second try, and he is, as the president has said, the greatest mayor in the history of New York City. He was also an equally great American patriot. The president said both of those things. Rudy Giuliani became the mayor of New York City in 1993 when he instituted the tough law and order policies that cleaned the city up and resulted in the revitalization of Times Square. After 9/11, he showed the true grit that he has. It was Giuliani's leadership that kept the country together during one of its darkest times. Then, after the stolen election of 2020, Giuliani stepped up again and led the efforts to oppose the fraud that I believe robbed President Trump of his rightful second term in the White House. Few in government, few in the country have done more to defend freedom and stand up against injustice than my friend Rudy Giuliani. I am praying for a speedy recovery, as I'm certain all Americans and all New Yorkers join me. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has ordered the removal of gender ideology from the public schools. President Trump has now ordered that this ideology, gender nonsense, be removed from public schools, threatening to withhold federal funds from public schools that refuse to comply. President Trump told his Department of Health and Human Services to direct 46 states and territories to eliminate any reference to gender ideology from their school curriculums and materials, or they would lose federal funding. The Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families terminated a grant in California last week after they refused to remove gender ideology from their materials, showing that the Trump administration means business. Acting Assistant Secretary Andrew Grayson said, accountability is coming. Federal funds will not be used to poison the minds of the next generation or advance dangerous ideological agendas. The Trump administration will ensure that the policies of this department reflect the intent of Congress, not the priorities of the radical left. Gender ideology was always a project that was funded by the government and so-called nonprofits funded by leftist billionaires like George Soros. It was never organic. It was thrust upon society by a cabal of extremely evil, child-abusing, demonic monsters. We must not forget who these people are in the months to come as the shoe drops and the prosecutions of some of these people transpire. Meanwhile, Robert Mueller, the so-called head of the Mueller witch hunt, has begged off on a subpoena from the House Oversight Committee investigating why Jeffrey Epstein, the child sex trafficker and pedophile, was given a mere slap on the wrist back in 2005. Robert Mueller's family says that he's too sick with Parkinson's to testify. As Joe Biden himself, who was clearly non-compos mentis virtually during his entire time as president, this sounds like malarkey to me. I do remember that during the congressional hearings in which they tried to reinflate the Russian collusion hoax, that Robert Mueller seemed non-compos mentis. When asked specifically about the prosecutor in my case and the fact that her name was Jeannie Rhee, had represented Hillary Clinton in the so-called illegal email server case, therefore had a bias against me since I wrote extensively about that case in my book, The Clintons' War on Women, which was an Amazon bestseller, as well as commenting on it, many interviews and print pieces at my website, Mueller said that he was unaware of that. So let me get this straight. Robert Mueller didn't know what his own law partner had done, didn't know that his own law partner had represented Hillary Clinton and therefore had a conflict of interest in my case. No, I believe that the House Oversight Committee has made a mistake in withdrawing the subpoena. In fact, I believe Robert Mueller should be compelled to testify, and if he refuses to do so, well, then he should be charged just like Peter Navarro was. In the meantime, Democrats, state representatives in Michigan are grooming children for transgendered mutilation, reaching out directly to kids, telling them they can get their drugs right there in the state. This state representative, Carrie Reagans, said, I am recording a video today to talk to you trans kids here in Michigan. I want you to know that the care you might want for gender-affirming care is legal in Michigan and is still continuing in a wide variety of places. The grown-ups at the University of Michigan Hospital are now under court order or anything. They are choosing to stop providing this care because they're scared of losing millions and millions of dollars from Medicare and Medicaid, which pays a lot of the services at the University of Michigan. So Representative Reagans told children to reach out to her office and she would help them in the grooming process for transgenderism. This is why merely defunding this transgender network is not enough. The proponents of transgenderism, which is, by the way, 0.8% of the U.S. population, particularly those who are pushing it on children, must be charged and imprisoned and treated as the sex offenders that they really are. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders is triggered. You might notice that Bernie Sanders used to criticize millionaires and billionaires, but now Bernie Sanders only criticizes billionaires. Why is that? Well, that's because Bernie Sanders and his wife skimmed millions of dollars from his two presidential campaigns in the form of media placement fees. That means Bernie Sanders is a millionaire. You see, Bernie wants socialism for ye, but not for Comrade Bernie. Comrade Bernie has 3 vacation homes. He's driving a top-of-the-line Mercedes. You see, this whole nonsense of socialism, that's for the proletariat, but not for Comrade Bernie. When we come back, I want to talk about how Bernie Sanders has been triggered by Robert F. Kennedy's swamp draining at the Center for Disease Control. Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, despite his denials, has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from executives with Big Pharma and is part of the ever-enduring swamp of Washington, D.C. You're listening to the Stone Zone right here on the Red Apple Audio Networks. When we come back, we'll talk about this struggle between Senator Bernie Sanders and these attacks on HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Whatever you do, don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. And also at the later in the show, we bring you the former superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, Richard Brezak, who's going to tell us exactly what's going on in the ground in Chicago and why he supports the idea of President Trump mobilizing the National Guard and sending them to the Windy City. We'll be right back.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back in the Stone Zone. I have to say that in a 50-year career in American politics, I've never seen a phonier, more pompous windbag, a greater loudmouth than Senator Bernie Sanders. And in all honesty, watching his public filings where he says he's only worth $3 million, I kind of doubt that is the case. If you look at the Federal Election Commission reports regarding payments to a company that he and his wife formed, he took far more than that out in terms of payments in media placement fees from his 2 presidential campaigns. Given the fact that he's actually never had a job in the private sector, that prior to his service in the U.S. Senate, he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, I find his filings to be questionable. But now he's attacking the Health and Human Services Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy, for fulfilling his mandates to drain the public health swamp by firing entrenched government bureaucrats. Sanders said, despite the overwhelming opposition of the medical community, Secretary Kennedy has continued his long-standing crusade against vaccinations and his advocacy of conspiracy theories that have been rejected repeatedly by scientific experts. Sanders called for RFK to resign. I'm calling for Senator Bernie Sanders to resign. You see, RFK Jr. has been a long-standing opponent to Big Pharma. Sanders, while proclaiming himself to be a socialist, has actually been one of the biggest single recipients of Big Pharma campaign dollars. That has caused him to toe the line, refuse to speak to Big Pharma's immense profit-seeking motives in pushing their unproven, untested, dangerous vaccinations onto the unsuspecting masses of the American people. This is not disputable. The vaccinations went through no clinical trials. Secondarily, those who manufactured the vaccinations had no legal liability. Thus, it is outrageous that Bernie Sanders, who is an immense hypocrite and a total fraud, is attacking RFK. Like all socialists, this is why Bernie Sanders, who ran for president as an opponent of war and as an opponent of the trade policies of the previous administration, is such a fraud. It's interesting to me that 1 out of 3 Sanders voters ended up voting for Donald Trump in 2016. Yet they stole the nomination for Bernie Sanders not once, but twice. Yet he turned around and first he endorsed Hillary Clinton, then he endorsed Joe Biden. So he has now, I think, been overshadowed by the likes of the Ayatollah Zoran Mamdani, and his movement is being co-opted for those who are more involved in Islamic zealotry. But Bernie Sanders' idea that he's somehow against special interests or dark money, when in fact he is the recipient of both. Really an extraordinarily exposed fraud at this point. Thanks for tuning in to the Stone Zone. When we come back, the former superintendent of the Chicago Police, Richard Brezak, joins us to talk about what's going on in the Windy City and why he supports the notion of President Donald Trump moving the National Guard into Chicago to restore safety to that community. We'll be right back.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
White House Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says that the Trump administration is considering declaring a housing emergency in the upcoming months due to the soaring cost of housing. They hope to make homes more affordable as real estate prices rise and higher mortgage rates price the middle class completely out of the market. Bessent said, "We're trying to figure out what we can do. We don't want to step into the business of states, counties, and municipal governments. I think everything is on the table." Of course, we all understand that the fundamental problem is the fact that we have not cut interest rates. This is kind of hard to understand because the last 4 times the Federal Reserve cut interest rates, inflation, and unemployment, which are the 2 measures that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors are supposed to take into consideration, were either at the same level or lower than they are today. So it's abundantly clear that the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, who, by the way, is not an economist or a housing expert, he's an attorney, is playing politics with the nation's housing market and therefore our economy. Powell continues to say that he doesn't want to cut rates on the American people because he's not sure what the impact will be of President Trump's efforts to make better tariff deals with our various trading partners. Yet I think the evidence is very clear what the impact of that is. Inflation remains historically low. The dollar remains strong. Unemployment remains low. We have a record Dow. The stock market's doing extraordinarily well. And all of that is without an interest rate cut. The shocking truth is that 30% of those who are married and homeowners has crashed by at least 40% in 1990 to about 15% today. That means only 15% of people in that age bracket are actually buying or attempting to buy a home. President Trump has inherited this crisis, and he's working very hard to restore the American dream. One way to do that is by depriving illegal aliens from federal housing assistance programs, which has been one way that prices have been artificially driven higher. Restoring order in Democrat-run wastelands will also add to the supply of livable homes that Americans will feel safe to live in. Thank God we have an administration that understands this problem, is taking active measures to solve it, rather than speaking in platitudes and sweeping the matter under the rug like establishment Republicans and Democrats have always done in the past. It continues to amaze me that Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson and Governor J.B. Pritzker continue to insist that crime in the Windy City is not a problem, when in fact, over Labor Day weekend, there were 58 shootings, 8 deaths. It is the murder capital of the United States. Last year, there were 226,000 phone calls to 9/11 that went to the Chicago Police Department and went completely unanswered. That's because the Chicago Police Department is down by 1,600 officers. That's because no one will apply for these jobs. That's because people who would be police officers know that the politicians will not have their back. So one way you can improve the housing market in the country is to have safer cities and safer suburbs. But the most important thing, of course, is a cut in interest rates. It is most definitely time. Now, speaking of the Federal Reserve, an independent journalist from Michigan recently traveled to one of Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook's properties and found, well, surprise, surprise, it's not her primary legal residence as she claimed. Journalist Charlie LaDuff of the Michigan Enjoyer did some good old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, going up to the Ann Arbor, Michigan property and knocking on the door in a video that he posted on YouTube. While at the door, he talked with some very uncomfortable people who confirmed that they were renting the property and they were not the owners of the home. Thanks to the head of the Federal Housing and Finance Agency, Bill Pulte, we now know that the Federal Reserve Board Governor, Lisa Cook, claimed that the home in Ann Arbor, Michigan, was her principal primary legal residence, even though she doesn't live there. We also learned that 2 weeks later, she got a mortgage on a property outside of Atlanta, where she also claimed it was her principal primary legal residence. Now, you don't have to be a genius to understand that you can't have two principal primary legal residences. Why would she do this? Well, the answer is obvious. In both states, she enjoyed a state tax reduction because she claimed it to be her principal residence. She also got a lower mortgage rate and a lower insurance rate. So it is very clear that Lisa Cook is engaged, at least in those two instances alone, in mortgage fraud. In addition, however, we've now learned, thanks to the fraud investigators at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two primary mortgage lenders in the United States, both of them headed by William Pulte, the head of the Federal Housing and Finance Agency, that she also had a bank loan on a secondary home in Massachusetts, which at some point she also claimed as her primary principal legal residence, but at other times claimed was an investment property. This is significant because the two have very different tax treatments. The Trump administration has found evidence that she's renting out that Atlanta home as well. So the truth is, each of these mortgages were taken out in 2021, just within a couple months of each other. Apparently, Lisa Cook never dreamed that she would be investigated for what appears to be a pattern of mortgage fraud. After all, she was the first black woman appointed to be a member of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Perhaps she thought that the DEI policies of the Biden administration would protect her. This made her among the highest on the woke totem pole as she was celebrated by the Biden regime as a champion of the merits of diversity. But unfortunately for Lisa Cook, this facade is crumbling and reality is setting in. She's been exposed as a fraudster as the Trump administration peers into the records of those who previously thought to be untouchable. Cook has been fired by President Trump as a board member of the Federal Reserve, and despite her delusional lawsuit that she seeks to overturn the dismissal, I don't believe she'll be returning to that position. What's disturbing, however, is the fact that when she filed the lawsuit, the clerk of the D.C. courts, Angela Caesar, assigned the case to Judge Gia Cobb. That's unusual because Judge Gia Cobb and Lisa Cook are both members of the same Black Women's College sorority. A very clear conflict of interest. Now, Clerk Caesar would have us believe that this assignment of the case was done by random draw, the spin of a wheel. But so far, she's produced no evidence to that effect. Then I found out yesterday that yet another member of this secret sorority is none other than Joy Reid. Joy Reid, whose, if her IQ was 1 point lower, you'd have to water her like a plant. It's amazing to me that the Justice Department has not moved to recuse Judge Gia Cobb from this case, giving her shocking conflict of interest. But this ultimately probably will end up going to the U.S. District Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia. I can tell you a lot about them as well. They're just as political as Judge Cobb. By the way, Judge Gia Cobb is the same judge who ruled only days ago that President Donald Trump didn't have the authority to deport illegal immigrants. So you can already see that this case has been sent to a virulent anti-Trump leftist activist judge. Normally, you would assume that a lower court decision, which did not hold that President Trump had the authority to fire a Federal Reserve Board governor for quote-unquote cause, would be overturned by the circuit, but not in the District of Columbia. I can tell you firsthand, having been through this particular meat grinder, that in the District of Columbia, the Constitution, the law, the rules, the evidence, none of these things actually matter. What matters is politics. And in this case, I think you will see Judge Cobb rule for Lisa Cook. Then there'll be a great celebration in the fake news media about how Trump fired this Federal Reserve Board governor, but never had the authority to do so. Then it'll go, after several months of this, it'll go to the District Court of Appeals. I think that's the flip of a coin. They may also incorrectly decide this case. And once again, very much like the decision today regarding illegal immigrants, it will ultimately just be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. Before it's all over, perhaps Lisa Cook can share a cell with New York Attorney General Letitia James. She's another one of these multicultural fraudsters who has been credibly accused of a 43-year crime spree of mortgage fraud. In her case, in her very first mortgage, she claimed that her father was her husband. She did that in order to utilize her father's balance sheet because alone she probably could not qualify for the mortgage. There's also new evidence that when she fell short of one of her mortgage applications, she quickly went to Columbia University and collected 2 checks, although what those checks exactly were for, oh, that's not clear at all. In yet another celebrated case, she applied for and got what is called a HAMP loan from the federal government. This is a loan designed for someone who owns investment properties, but to get a HAMP loan, your investment property must be 4 rentable units or less. Unfortunately, the property that Letitia James had was 5 units, but that's not what she said in the applications for the mortgage. And then more recently, as we now know, she applied for and got a mortgage for a property in Virginia, but in the power of attorney, which she signed in 12 different places. So much for the argument that this was a typographical error. She claimed that the property in Virginia would be her primary principal legal residence. Of course, if that were true, then under the New York State Constitution, Letitia James would not be eligible to be the state attorney general. In the meantime, we learned, and this story was broken right here in the Stone Zone, that the home in Virginia that Letitia James, the Attorney General, borrowed and got a mortgage for is actually inhabited by her niece. And her niece has at least 3 criminal warrants out for her. So the chief law enforcement officer of the state of New York is harboring an illegal fugitive from justice. How long can this go on? I think it was Letitia James who said, no one is above the law. What she's about to find out is that no one includes her. This is a prosecutor who, after all, accused Donald Trump of inflating the value of his assets in order to make commercial real estate loans, all of which he paid back on time, and those lenders made $40 million in interest. No one has ever been prosecuted under this law, but she got a $554 million judgment against the president that was overturned by the federal courts only days ago. No, justice is here, and those on CNN and MSNBC who say that this is weaponization or that this is retaliation or revenge don't understand that what we have now is equal application of the law. Thanks to the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency and the policies of President Donald Trump, those who violate the law will be held responsible. I'm Roger Stone. You're listening to Stone Zone right here in the Red Apple Audio Networks. Whatever you do, don't go away because we'll be right back.
The Stone Zone, entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
And we're back in the Stone Zone. I join you today from Washington, D.C. I must say I've never seen the city look so clean and so safe. What's interesting to me is the people who actually live here are very, very happy that President Donald Trump both federalized the Metropolitan D.C. Police and mobilized the National Guard in order to bring safety back to the communities and the neighborhoods of the District of Columbia. The only people who seem to be unhappy about it are the politicians. We see the same thing playing out in Chicago. Yesterday, I interviewed former Chicago Police Superintendent Richard Brezak, who explained to us that since the 1980s, the politicians in the city of Chicago have refused to back up the police, causing an enormous gap in the credibility of the Chicago Police Department. Very clear to me that President Donald Trump has already made the decision to mobilize the National Guard and to send them to Chicago. In fact, he himself yesterday said, it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. Once again, I predict to you, despite what Mayor Brandon Johnson says, who seems to be rallying the people of Chicago to oppose those who would go there to preserve order and safety, that the people of Chicago will be relieved if the National Guard clean up the crime situation in Chicago as they have in the District of Columbia. Meanwhile, MultiCare's Mary Bridge Children's Hospital in Tacoma, Washington, was shut down because their gender clinic for children was violating the law, and they will no longer be providing puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and other treatments designed to facilitate gender transitions for children. The hospital scrubbed most of the information about so-called gender-affirming care for children from their website. A hospital spokesman said that the hospital would continue providing behavioral health care, which includes mental health assessments, counseling, and support services to children with gender dysphoria following the change. This has become a nationwide trend following President Trump's executive order to prohibit or limit access to these controversial procedures. The hospitals are responding to the incentives, fearful that they may lose federal grant money if they do not comply with the administration's new rules. The purity and dignity of thousands of children could be saved because President Donald Trump's bold leadership in this area. The next step is to criminally charge those responsible for drugging and mutilating these children for sexual abuse. Meanwhile, Wisconsin's schools has covered up the facts regarding the recent transgender school shooting. Les Paul Middle School in Waukesha, Wisconsin, covered up the deranged plot of a 13-year-old transgendered student who plotted to commit a Columbine-style mass shooting at the school in October of 2024. This transgendered student, whose identity has not yet publicly been revealed, reportedly sent messages to students about guns, ammo, and bragged about making a hit list and began recruiting accomplices for the purposes of committing this incredibly heinous crime. The children were quietly expelled from school, but the school administrators never alerted the public or the students' parents about exactly what had occurred. Radio host Dan O'Donnell broke this story, stating that he believed that the school administrator had covered this up and the subsequent media blackout of the story happened because they feared reprisal from a transgendered community if the truth had been made known. It's time to start treating transgender activists who act like terrorists exactly what they are, terrorists, as clearly they pose a clear and present danger to the safety of all Americans, perhaps a greater danger than some of our foreign enemies. Meanwhile, the Federal Appeals Court has allowed termination of these giant federal grants for climate change. This appeals court decision by the Trump administration will terminate $16 billion in climate change-related grants. This reverses a ruling by U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan, stopping the federal government from withholding these grants. This is very good news indeed. Only yesterday, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson said the number one problem facing African Americans was climate change. That's right. You heard it here in the Stone Zone. Until tomorrow, God bless you and Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to The Stone Zone with Roger Stone. You can hear The Stone Zone with Roger Stone weeknights at 8 on 77 WABC. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode, so you never have to wonder,
what the heck is going on here?